They vanished without a trace. 115 men, women, and children simply disappeared from Roanoke Island in 1587, leaving behind nothing but an empty settlement and a single cryptic word carved into a tree. For 400 years, this mystery tormented historians and sparked wild theories. Were they slaughtered by Native Americans? Did they attempt a suicide mission across the Atlantic? Were they eliminated by Spanish invaders? But recent archaeological discoveries have uncovered something far more shocking than anyone imagined, evidence that challenges everything we thought we knew about their fate. And it all points to a dark secret buried underground for centuries. The story of the lost colony of Roanoke is one of ambition, desperation, and ultimately one of humanity's most remarkable survival stories. But for centuries, it was hidden beneath layers of speculation, legend, and misunderstanding. Now, for the first time in over 400 years, the truth is emerging from the soil of North Carolina, revealing a narrative so extraordinary that it reshapes our understanding of English colonization, indigenous relations, and the very foundations of American history. In 1585, Sir Walter Raleigh launched an expedition to accomplish what no European power had successfully achieved, establishing a permanent English settlement in North America. Raleigh understood that the future of empires would be determined by who controlled the New World. The Spanish had established themselves in the south, and the French were pushing down from the north. England had to act decisively. Raleigh's first expedition was exploratory, consisting primarily of soldiers. They reached Roanoke Island off the coast of present-day North Carolina and established a temporary presence. But Raleigh envisioned something far grander, a true permanent settlement where English families could establish themselves and create a foothold for English expansion. By 1587, Raleigh organized his third expedition with approximately 115 people, including women and children, artisans, farmers, merchants, and laborers. This was meant to be the beginning of English civilization in the New World. Raleigh selected John White to lead this venture, a man who was not merely a military commander, but an artist, naturalist, and educated gentleman with the intelligence needed to govern a complex colonial enterprise. John White arrived with his daughter Eleanor and her husband Ananias Dare. Among the settlers was Eleanor Dare, who gave birth to Virginia Dare, the first English child born in North America. The colonists immediately began establishing their settlement, constructing fortifications, and attempting to trade with the indigenous Algonquian peoples. Initially, relations between the English and local tribes were peaceful. The Algonquians, particularly the Roanoke village people, had previous experience with European traders. They shared knowledge about local plants, hunting techniques, and survival methods. For a brief moment, genuine cooperation seemed possible between the two peoples. But harsh realities quickly set in. Food supplies dwindled rapidly. The crops planted did not produce as expected. Diseases ravaged the settlement, killing several colonists. Tensions emerged between English settlers and their indigenous hosts. The Algonquians, facing their own resource constraints, resented the burden of feeding and sheltering over 100 hungry newcomers. John White found himself in an impossible situation. The colony's survival hung by a thread. He recognized that without additional supplies and reinforcements from England, the entire venture would collapse. In August of 1587, after just a few months in the New World, White made the agonizing decision to return to England. He would gather supplies, recruit more colonists, and return as quickly as possible. Before departing, White established a protocol with the colonists. If they were forced to leave their current location, they should carve their destination into a tree in Roman letters. Critically, if they left in distress or were fleeing danger, they should carve a cross above the destination name. This simple system would allow White to understand at a glance whether the colonists had evacuated voluntarily or been driven away by some catastrophe. White promised that he would return within 2 years. He left behind his daughter, his granddaughter, Virginia Dare, and everyone else who would become known to history as the Lost Colony. But England's fate intervened. In 1588, the Spanish Armada attacked English shores, plunging the nation into war. Resources were redirected to military defense. Ships that might have carried supplies to Roanoke were instead engaged in naval combat or defending English coastlines. John White, stranded in London, could only watch helplessly as months turned into years. Yes, the promised 2-year return became 3 years, then 4. The Spanish threat gradually subsided, but so did the urgency of resupplying a distant colonial venture that few people in England remembered or understood. It was not until 1590 that John White finally managed to secure passage back to Roanoke Island. When he and his crew arrived at the settlement, what they discovered would haunt the imagination of Americans for centuries to come. The settlement appeared to have been systematically abandoned. Fortifications were overgrown with vines and creeping vegetation. The wooden structures were weathered and deteriorating. There were no fresh footprints, no signs of recent activity, no indication that anyone had lived here for months, perhaps longer. But what shocked White most profoundly was not what he found, but what he did not find. There were no bodies, no bones, no graves, no evidence of plague or mass death. There were no signs of violence, no burned buildings, no weapons scattered about, as if there had been a desperate last stand. This was not the scene of a massacre. This was not the remnants of a catastrophe. This appeared to be an orderly, planned evacuation. And then White's crew found the tree. Carved into its bark in Roman letters were 4 words that would puzzle and torment historians for the next 4 centuries. The word Croatoan, written with no cross above it. According to the protocol White himself had established, this meant the colonists had evacuated voluntarily and relocated to Croatoan Island, the home of the Croatoan people, a tribe that had maintained friendly relations with the English. The absence of a cross was supposed to indicate that they had left in an orderly manner, not fleeing from danger. White wanted desperately to sail to Croatoan Island to investigate further, but a violent storm prevented the voyage. The winds were too strong, the seas too treacherous. After waiting several days for conditions to improve, White was forced to accept the impossibility of his mission. He returned to England without knowing the fate of his daughter, his granddaughter, or any of the colonists he had left behind. The not knowing would haunt him until his death. Over the following centuries, the mystery of Roanoke became increasingly elaborate in the popular imagination. Historians spun theories, novelists created elaborate narratives. The colonists were said to have been absorbed into Native American tribes. They had supposedly marched inland to some hidden settlement deep in the wilderness. Some believed they had attempted the impossible journey back across the Atlantic and perished at sea. Others insisted they had been slaughtered by Spanish raiders or hostile tribes. The mystery became less a historical question and more a legend, a ghost story embedded deeply into American folklore. But beginning in the early 2000s, something revolutionary began to happen. A group of dedicated archaeologists and historians formed the first Colony Foundation with a singular mission: to use modern scientific methodology to uncover the truth about what actually happened to the Roanoke colonists. These researchers brought to their work technologies and techniques that had not existed in previous centuries. Ground, penetrating radar could detect subsurface disturbances without requiring extensive excavation. Advanced ceramic analysis could date pottery fragments to specific decades based on their composition and manufacturing techniques. Chemical analysis could determine the origin of materials. DNA sequencing could establish biological relationships. For the first time in 400 years, archaeologists had tools that could recover truth from archaeological contexts. The Foundation's investigators were guided by historical documents that held crucial clues. Most significantly, they discovered that John White himself had left behind a secret map. Housed in the British Museum in London, this map had been created between 1585 and 1593. But this was no ordinary map. When studied under backlighting, researchers discovered something extraordinary. 2 forts were marked on the map in invisible ink. Why would White hide these locations? The most plausible explanation was that he was protecting them from Spanish eyes, concealing the locations where English colonists had relocated or planned to relocate, preventing this sensitive military information from falling into enemy hands. This hidden map provided archaeologists with something they had lacked for centuries: specific geographical locations to investigate. White's map suggested that the colonists had planned to move approximately 50 miles inland from Roanoke Island, and it suggested that there might be multiple settlement locations. This revelation fundamentally changed the nature of the archaeological investigation. Researchers began focusing on 2 primary areas. The first was Hatteras Island, located approximately 50 miles southeast of Roanoke Island. The second was inland in what is now Bertie County, North Carolina, approximately 50 miles to the west and northwest of Roanoke. This geographical division would prove to be the key that unlocked the mystery. The archaeological evidence from Hatteras Island came from multiple independent investigations. Scott Dawson, a local historian who founded the Croatoan Archaeological Society, conducted systematic excavations near Cape Creek. Mark Horton, a chief archaeologist working with other research teams, led complementary investigations at the same location. Over years of careful work, these researchers recovered artifacts that seemed almost impossible at first: fragments of a slate writing tablet marked with the letter M, a rapier hilt, the ornamental handle of a sword, definitively dated to the late 16th century. Pieces of iron, metal ingots, and English stoneware from the same period. But the truly remarkable finding was not individual artifacts, but their context. These English items were found in the same soil layers as Croatoan pottery and arrowheads. At depths of 4 to 6 feet in the ground, archaeologists discovered a complex stratum containing material remains of both English and indigenous life in intimate association. The implications were stunning. English colonists had not simply passed through this location or traded briefly with the Croatoan people. They had lived here. They had coexisted with the indigenous population. They had shared the same space, the same daily routines, the same environment. Even more compelling was historical documentation that emerged from colonial records. Documents from Jamestown, the permanent English settlement established in Virginia in 1607, contained references to Roanoke colonists who had relocated to live with friendly Native American tribes. These were not speculations or legends, but official reports from English colonial administrators. Furthermore, more than a century after the lost colony's disappearance, the English explorer John Lawson encountered native peoples in North Carolina who displayed remarkable and unexplained characteristics. Some had blue eyes, an extremely unusual feature among indigenous populations. Even more remarkably, these Native Americans recounted to Lawson that their ancestors could speak English and could read from books. These oral traditions, passed down through generations, suggested that English colonists had not merely survived among the Croatoan people, but had integrated so thoroughly that their language and literacy had been preserved and transmitted to their descendants. The evidence pointing to an inland relocation was equally striking, but came from different archaeological contexts. Researchers focusing on areas west and northwest of Roanoke discovered what became known as Site X and Site Y in Bertie County. These locations were identified through traditional archaeological survey work and significantly enhanced through the application of ground-penetrating radar technology. This sophisticated equipment could detect subsurface anomalies suggesting previous human habitation without requiring massive excavation. At these inland sites, archaeologists made discoveries that directly paralleled those found at Hatteras. They unearthed distinctive English pottery that could be precisely dated to the late 16th century. Surrey, Hampshire borderware, North Devon baluster jars, Spanish olive jars, London redware, Essex fine redware, and Martincamp stoneware. These were not luxury items or prestige goods acquired through distant trade networks. They were practical domestic vessels, the dishes, storage containers, and cooking equipment of everyday life. The presence of these ceramic types was significant because pottery style, manufacturing technique, and material composition changed over time with sufficient regularity that archaeologists could date fragments with remarkable accuracy. But perhaps the most extraordinary discovery at these inland sites was evidence of active metalworking. Archaeologists recovered hammerscale, the tiny fragments of metal and slag that accumulate around blacksmithing operations. This was not evidence of occasional contact or casual trading. Encounters between English and indigenous peoples. Hammerscale indicated that English colonists had lived at these locations long enough and with sufficient resources to establish active workshops. They were manufacturing tools, fashioning weapons, and producing metal items. This level of settlement stability suggested something profound. These colonists had successfully integrated into indigenous communities. They had gained access to food resources reliable enough to support craftspeople. They had achieved status somehow sufficient to establish workshops. They had become recognized members of the communities they joined. The research team, led by archaeologist Nicholas Lachetti of the First Colony Foundation, conducted particularly intensive excavations at these inland sites. Beyond pottery and metalworking evidence, they recovered fragments of weapons, including pieces of gun flintlocks and sections of swords. They discovered a metal hook used to stretch animal hides or construct tents, suggesting active processing of natural materials and production. They found an aglet, a small copper tube, used to secure wool fibers before the advent of modern fasteners in the 17th century. Each individual artifact, though small and seemingly insignificant, was actually a window into the lives of people making do with what they had, adapting English technology and knowledge to an entirely new environmental and cultural context. The most recent, and perhaps most stunning excavations have come from Elizabethan gardens in Manteo on Roanoke Island itself. In 2023 and 2024, the First Colony Foundation conducted investigations focusing on the location of the Algonquian village of Roanoke, the indigenous community that had hosted the English explorers. These excavations revealed something that sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. Direct physical evidence of intimate interaction between English settlers and local Algonquian populations. Excavators unearthed shards of Algonquian pottery dating to the 1500s alongside European copper items. Most remarkably, a copper wire ring, likely worn by a Native American warrior. This copper ring represented far more than a simple artifact. Copper was brought to North America as a precious commodity by English traders. Indigenous peoples valued copper with what can only be described as spiritual reverence, regarding it as immensely more precious than gold or silver. For a Native American warrior to wear a copper ring made from drawn copper wire was a mark of extraordinary status, power, and wealth within his community. The presence of this ring alongside domestic pottery and in domestic contexts suggested not merely trading contact, but intimate cultural exchange and integration. Archaeologists speculate that copper items were brought to America specifically as trade goods, valued gifts and commodities intended to facilitate commerce and establish diplomatic relationships with indigenous peoples. The archaeological evidence suggested these items had been incorporated into daily indigenous life, worn, treasured, and preserved. This indicated a level of trust and acceptance that transcended the barriers of culture and language. It suggested genuine relationships had formed between people from radically different worlds. Taken together, The archaeological evidence from Hatteras Island, from inland sites X and Y, and from Elizabethan gardens on Roanoke Island itself pointed toward a revolutionary conclusion that fundamentally reframed 4 centuries of historical speculation. The colonists had not vanished. They had not been destroyed by disease, massacre, or Spanish conquest. Instead, they had made a calculated and pragmatic decision to ensure their survival. When it became clear that England could not reliably resupply them, and that maintaining an isolated English enclave on Roanoke Island was increasingly untenable, they had split into groups. Some had gone to Hatteras Island to live among the Croatoan people. Others had moved inland to establish communities in close proximity to other Algonquian groups. Rather than perishing in isolation, they had adapted. Rather than attempting to maintain a culturally separate English settlement, they had integrated into Native American societies that were willing to accept them, protect them, and provide access to resources necessary for survival. This interpretation was not without skeptics. Some respected archaeologists and historians remained unconvinced that the artifacts recovered could be definitively attributed to the Roanoke colonists. Dating small metal and glass objects with precision sufficient to rule out later European trade, rather than direct colonist contact, remained genuinely difficult. Some researchers argued that the evidence remained circumstantial and open to alternative interpretations. The scholarly consensus acknowledged that none of the discoveries constituted absolutely definitive, unambiguous proof beyond any conceivable shadow of doubt. Yet the fundamental nature of the historical debate had shifted dramatically. For more than 4 centuries, every theory about Roanoke rested entirely on second-hand written accounts, oral tradition, and educated guesswork. Now, for the first time in American history, archaeologists had recovered material evidence directly connected to the time period and circumstances of the colony. They could analyze soil composition to determine if it had been disturbed by European activity. They could examine pottery under magnification and apply chemical analysis to its precise components. They could study the archaeological context in which artifacts were discovered, noting what was found together, at what depths beneath the surface, and what combinations and associations. The archaeological consensus that emerged was that a split colony model made the most sense of all available evidence. James Horn, president of Jamestown Rediscovery and board member of the First Colony Foundation, articulated this theory with careful precision. Possibly, a small group had gone to Croatoan Island in the fall or winter of 1587 to wait for John White to return with supplies, while the remainder of the colonists had moved inland. This theory reconciled the physical evidence from multiple geographically separated sites. It explained why artifacts appeared in 2 distinct locations 50 miles apart. It accounted for the word Croatoan carved on the tree without any cross indicating distress or emergency. It aligned with John White's own statements indicating that the colonists had planned to relocate 50 miles inland. What makes this conclusion particularly compelling and transformative is that it converts the lost colony from a tragic mystery into a human survival story. These English settlers, faced with genuinely impossible circumstances, made rational decisions based on available information and resources. They recognized that their experiment on Roanoke Island was failing. The island could not sustainably support over 100 people. Regular supply ships from England were unreliable and infrequent. Disease was constant. Starvation was an ever-present threat. Rather than perish as the last remnants of a failed colonial venture, rather than attempt impossible journeys across an ocean they could not traverse, they dispersed strategically. They leveraged the relationships they had cultivated with indigenous peoples. They convinced Algonquian tribes to accept them into their communities. They adopted indigenous ways of life while maintaining certain elements of their English culture and material goods, as evidenced by the continuing presence of English artifacts generations later in archaeological strata. Their descendants, if they had any, lived on. Some may have eventually been assimilated so completely into Native American communities that their English heritage became merely a distant memory, a story passed down through oral tradition about ancestors who came from across the great waters, who spoke a strange language, who possessed knowledge of distant lands. Others may have maintained stronger connections to their English identity, preserving knowledge of the English language and the ability to read, accomplishments that John Lawson specifically remarked upon more than a century later when he encountered Native Americans with blue eyes who could speak English. The strategy adopted by the Roanoke colonists, adaptation rather than insular isolation, was, in retrospect, the only viable approach to survival in this environment. The indigenous peoples of the Carolina coast had successfully adapted to this region for centuries, developing sophisticated methods for exploiting local resources, preserving food for winter months, navigating climate challenges and natural hazards. By accepting the help of these peoples and allowing themselves to be absorbed into existing communities, rather than attempting to maintain a separate English enclave isolated and dependent only on ocean-borne supplies, the colonists chose pragmatism and survival over cultural purity and ideological isolation. This interpretation also explains something that had long puzzled historians. why the colonists apparently left so few traces for John White and subsequent searchers to discover. If the colonists had remained isolated and distinct, seeking to preserve English culture and customs in their entirety, they likely would not have survived. Beyond a few additional years, starvation and disease would have inevitably claimed them all. But by integrating into indigenous communities, they gained immediate access to reliable food sources, medical knowledge, adapted to local conditions, and social structures that provided stability, purpose, and community. The evidence suggests that this integration was not violent or forced, but rather a negotiated process of mutual benefit. The English possessed goods and technologies valued by indigenous peoples, particularly metal items and weapons, manufactured through specialized metalworking knowledge. They possessed knowledge of ocean, navigation in distant lands that might have fascinated their new hosts. More importantly, Roanoke Island and the surrounding coastal region was not a densely populated area under strict territorial control by any single powerful tribe. The Algonquian peoples of this region, including the Croatoan and neighboring groups, had historical and cultural traditions of incorporating outsiders into their communities. A group of skilled and technologically sophisticated newcomers might have been seen as a valuable addition to a community, not as a threat requiring destruction or expulsion. The journey from mystery to explanation required extraordinary patience, advanced technology, and meaningful collaboration across multiple disciplines. Modern archaeology brought together professional archaeologists, historians, botanists, geologists, and other specialists. It required systematic survey work across vast areas. It required test excavations, an extensive analysis of thousands of artifacts. It required the application of technologies that allowed researchers to see beneath soil without necessarily destroying the archaeological context. It required careful reasoning about dating, provenance, and interpretation. It required acknowledging uncertainty while still drawing reasonable conclusions based on the preponderance of accumulated evidence. The implications of this archaeological interpretation extend far beyond the specific fate of the Roanoke colonists. It suggests that the first contact between English settlers and North American indigenous peoples was far more complex than previous generations had imagined. Rather than conflict leading to indigenous defeat and displacement, at least initially, there was negotiation, integration, and mutual adaptation. English colonists learned from indigenous peoples how to survive in this new environment. Indigenous peoples acquired English goods and technologies. Relationships formed across cultural boundaries. People learned to live together despite profound differences in language, custom, and tradition. Today, the lost colony of Roanoke is lost no longer in any meaningful sense, though perhaps not in the way most people expected. The colonists were not destroyed by savage tribes or lost to the sea. They were not killed by disease or Spanish raiders or by some unknown catastrophe. They survived through adaptation, through choosing to become part of the land and its peoples rather than remaining separate from them. In doing so, they became the first significant integration between English settlers and North American indigenous peoples, a merger that produced new communities and new identities. The word Croatoan, carved into that tree so many centuries ago, was not a desperate plea or a cryptic riddle meant to be solved centuries later. It was likely a calm statement of intention, a location marker in a story of survival and adaptation that would echo through the centuries. When John White read those letters, he may not have fully understood their true meaning, but modern archaeologists, with their sophisticated tools and their scientific methods and their collaborative approaches, have finally decoded the message written in soil and pottery and metal. The colonists had not disappeared into thin air. They had not perished mysteriously. They had simply moved forward, adapting to the new world in the most profoundly human way possible, by embracing the people and the land they encountered, by making pragmatic choices in desperate circumstances, by surviving against enormous odds through collaboration, acceptance, and the willingness to change. The mystery of the lost colony endures in a different form now. We may never know all the details of how these specific individuals lived after leaving Roanoke. We may never know all their names or all their personal stories. We may never have the complete narrative of their adaptation and integration, but we know that they lived. We know they did not simply vanish into historical obscurity. We know they found a way forward in a strange new world, and in knowing that, we have finally solved one of America's greatest historical mysteries, replacing dark speculation with evidence, and revealing a more human, more resilient, more compelling truth than legend could ever provide.